Hey, curious people, you're listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the Self-Led Sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. Today's guest describes herself as coming from a long line of colorful neurodivergent brains and is being drawn to the passionate, the quirky, and the uniquely wired for as long as she can remember. No wonder we had such a great connection. Kory Andreas is a clinical social worker, autism specialist, and neurodiversity educator with a deep passion for working with neurodiverse couples. As a late diagnosed autistic clinician, Kory brings both professional expertise and lived experience to her work, helping autistic and ADHD adults navigate relationships, intimacy, and communication in a world designed for neurotypical norms. Through assessments, therapy, trainings, and practical strategies, she helps neurodiverse couples communicate more effectively, reduce frustration, and create relationships that feel safe, fulfilling, and sustainable. In this episode, Kory shares her personal and professional journey, and together we explore ways to help neurodiverse couples navigate relationships and sexuality in ways that work for them. In the latter portion, I invite Kory's nerding parts to ask whatever questions they have about IFS, which is a newer area for her. And we wound up doing a short role play where Kory shares concerns as an ADHD partner who sometimes recoils from touch but doesn't want to upset her partner. Check out her articles on neurodiverse couples therapy and on autism and eating disorders in the March 2025 issue of the Psychotherapy Networker magazine. And please stay tuned now for an engaging and informative conversation. Kory, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. I met you just about exactly a year ago when we were on a writer's retreat in
Yes.
Joshua Tree, California with
So
Tammy
warm.
Nelson.
Yes. Oh, what an amazing weekend that was, and much warmer weather.
Absolutely. So I'm thrilled that you're here, and I know a lot of listeners have a lot of questions about this topic of neurodiversity and sexuality and whether they're therapists or people managing their own lives or in relationships. I'm excited about what our conversation will bring forward.
Yes. Thank you so
So
much for having me. This is just a thrill. I am so excited to talk today.
awesome. So, do you want to tell us where you are to start with?
Yeah, I am in Maryland. I'm right between DC and Baltimore, so that's the area that I come from. So it is freezing here, and we are very close to a lot going on in this country as we speak.
Absolutely. And what are you noticing as we step in, whether it's parts you're aware of or just a sense of maybe your thoughts or feelings or
Yeah.
however you tune into yourself, which I'm actually curious about if that's any different
Oh,
than
yeah.
how others might do that.
I'm told I have a very adult part that loves to share information and is very nerdy and very excited to educate and to get into deep conversations. So that is a part that I love and really cling to quite a bit. So that is always the first part that is sort of driving the ship here for me. And I get really, really excited when I'm able to do, to kind of act in that role. But there is always, I think anytime you do a podcast or you put yourself out there personally or professionally, there's always that much younger part that is so worried you're going to say the wrong thing or you're going to offend people or, in an attempt to help you, do the opposite. So I'm always aware of that when I'm speaking in real time. It is a little bit
Yeah,
vulnerable.
absolutely. Yes, I appreciate your sharing that here with us, and I can certainly recognize those kinds of parts in myself at the beginning of each and every conversation. And this particular conversation, because there's so much new knowledge, new awarenesses in the field for therapists and also for consumers and just people that are wanting to learn more about this topic. And we'll get into that more in a minute. But I guess wondering if you'd want to share anything more about yourself, how
Yeah.
you identify.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am a late diagnosed autistic adult. So I was diagnosed a few years ago, which is just kind of a fascinating story in and of itself. But yeah, I am autistic. I have ADHD. I have been a notoriously anxious person since a very early age. And I think within, my career, I was exposed to a lot of autistic boys younger in my career. So when I was working in the schools, that was predominantly who I was working with. A lot of ADHD, a lot of autism in boys, but I didn't identify with any of that. Nothing really stuck there. And it wasn't until I was much, much older and actually have a daughter who was diagnosed when she was 6 that we started paying attention to, wait a minute, this is not at all what autism looks like in my career at the time. So for the last several years in private practice, I work exclusively with adults now, and with a lot of women and a lot of gender diverse adults. And there is just this whole other world of high masking autism that we didn't know anything about when I was in grad school. So through my work as a private practice therapist, I do a lot of autism assessments. My eyes were just really opened to a lot of things that I just had never seen in practice with boys. So I kind of recognize my own neurodivergence and recognize some of the things that I had really named in a different way throughout the course of my life were really a product of, just different wiring that no one understood at the time. So it has been a huge transformation in my thinking personally about myself and also with clients, my family, my relationships. So I think that part that I was talking about before that loves to teach and talk about the subject, it's coming from that place of this was really a huge eye-opening experience for me to understand myself differently.
So I am curious about so many things you've already shared, Kory, in that description of your journey. One is a couple terms that you used. You said high masking autism, and you talked about neurodiversity and autism. And since we'll be using those terms today, I'm wondering if we could pause a minute, just if you would be okay to explain that. And then the thing I want to come back to is like, what was that impact? Because you said it's changed your life so much.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the idea of terminology. It is such a wild ride to go to grad school, work in the field, and have everything just completely change in the middle of your career. But yeah, the terminology has gone, in a totally different direction. I remember when I was in the schools, we were taught to say person with autism. And if you referred to someone as autistic during that time, it was, we would get in trouble. Somebody would tell you that's disrespectful. So it used to be that person first language, and it's gone completely the other direction now. Most people prefer the term autistic and take an identity first approach. So, we used to say on the spectrum a lot, or, people would say, spectrumy or person suffering from autism or dealing with autism, living with autism, things like that. And now autistic is generally the way that most people prefer to use the term. And a lot of other things, not that long ago, and I still hear it quite a bit today, people would talk about, being high functioning versus low functioning back when Asperger's was in the picture. And now a lot of people find that to be really offensive because most of the symptoms of autism in high masking individuals are really internal. So that the idea of high masking being that there's sort of like almost like a public persona of sorts, if you want to call it that, where people are adapting and assimilating in public and trying to present as neurotypical, but their internal experience is still very, very different. So there's a lot of anxiety associated with that and a lot of concern for how people are receiving you and things like that. So it often, especially in women and gender diverse people, there's a lot of internal impact that you just can't see. So to say, oh, that's a high functioning person because they have a job and a relationship and kids and hobbies and things like that doesn't really take into account what's going on on the inside for them. So we don't love high and low functioning either.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know that your background is not in IFS, although you're aware of parts and,
Yeah.
have some exposure, but I'm just thinking about parts that have those jobs of masking and
Yes.
mediating and how exhausting that can be.
Exhausting. Yeah,
Mhm.
very, very much so. And, it's interesting. A lot of my clients have come to me after working with phenomenal therapists who have kind of informed them on this parts work. And they will come to me and say, well, let me tell you about my parts before we get started. So it's great, actually. I get a lot of that secondhand to understand. And I think that framework actually works very, very well with autistic brains, in that there is often kind of this idea of extremes. There's a lot of being really, really intensely good at certain things and having a lot of struggle with other things. And so it naturally really lends itself to seeing yourself as not just one person, but, a complicated blend of lots of different parts.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear.
Mhm.
Yeah. So you described high masking, and I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about the word autistic as you're
Sure.
using it. Yeah, you explained a little bit about the internal subjective experience, but maybe could you say a little more?
Sure. So in terms of like what people when people identify that way, what that means. Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the idea that we were taught in school is, the DSM criteria, and it was sort of this very different, very obvious, hard to ignore kind of presentation of autism that we learned about, at least when I was in school. And now what we're learning is that it's actually a blend of a lot of different traits. It's a very specific type of brain, and I think to me sometimes it helps to help people compare it to other things. There was a time when the DSM included homosexuality, and that was something that we pathologized before we understood that, that is just a type of person, and this is very similar, and that this is a type of person. And there are certain things that go along with that, but there's a saying, if you know one autistic person, you know one autistic person, because no two people present with the same combination of traits. So it is a very interesting thing and sort of complicated, I think, to explain, especially with families. You could have two neurodivergent parents, maybe one's ADHD, maybe one's autistic, maybe they're both autistic, but they present so differently. And then, I have families that have three kids, everyone in the house is autistic, and no two people look remotely the same in their presentation. So it's not anything that you can identify with any kind of consistency from looking at people, but it's really just the idea that there's a blend of areas that are impacted, and those, that each individual has a different impact, if that makes any sense.
Mhm. Yeah. So
Yeah.
how is there how do you know if someone you're working with is autistic? Is it a self-diagnosis that people make? But we still have the question of your story too, and the impact
Yeah.
of understanding yourself in this way and
Yeah.
how that has mattered.
One might lead to the other. I think with my story, when I looked at the DSM criteria when I started my career to understand, and at that time we had Asperger's. So at that time when I started practicing, we were told Asperger's was high functioning autism, and these are the kids that are in, typical schools, and they can be really verbal, and they have extreme interests, and there were just a lot of stereotypes that we were sort of being fed. And then, with more time and more understanding, when I started to see in more recent years, some of the changes that had happened, and people sort of accepting this identity and speaking more about that identity online. We're seeing a lot more self-diagnosed people because they're recognizing people on the internet that look like them, sound like them, talk like them, have interests like them. And so they're, flocking to therapists right now to get more information. So for me, I think I didn't realize what that presentation looked like until I saw it in other people. Like I really had to kind of wrap my brain around the framework and what it looked like in women and gender diverse clients. So that was why it didn't really resonate for me, because if you look at the DSM criteria, that's not an obvious match for what was showing up in me and my family. So I started meeting with women, and it was sort of this uncanny feeling of I've never heard somebody explain that like that, except that's what goes through my head. And so for the first, couple years, I was sort of keeping that in and thinking about it a lot. And then it felt to me like I almost felt like I could predict what people were going to say. I sort of had a feeling for what their answers were going to be. People were using the exact same words to explain their experiences. They were giving the same exact answers. And it became one of those situations where I thought, this has to be something other people are noticing. And after a
Were these, can I
while,
just ask, were these
yeah,
client, like you talk, listening to clients or
clients.
people on the
Yeah.
internet or?
Yes, I mean both, but mostly, clients at that time because that's what I was doing. But, it was you asked somebody a question about how did you feel about group work in school, which is something I don't think most therapists are asking. And it was like, oh, I hate group work. There's one of two ways that would go down. I would either do everything because nobody in the group could be trusted to do the work because they didn't know as much as me, or I would do nothing and shut down and not talk to anyone. And I would think, wow, that sounds really familiar. So, you have 12 people in a week tell you that same answer. And you're like, oh, that's really interesting. So it was a lot for me. It was a lot of eye-opening just assessment work where I had gotten this certification in neurodiverse couples counseling. I was loving it. I was having so much fun doing this job. It was such a great change in my career to go from working with teenagers to back into adult worlds. But it was weird. It was a little jarring for me to go, wow, it's, a lot of the things that I thought of as my own personality, my own quirks, my own, kind of strengths and weaknesses. It's really weird to hear people using the exact same words you would explain and sharing experiences that sounds so similar to what I had happen growing up and in relationships. So with that, that's sort of where everything changed. And I really took a deep dive into reading absolutely everything I could get my hands on, watching everything, just ingesting every little bit of information I could get. And it was just unbelievably validating and fascinating. So it has been sort of the fuel that has, been propelling me forward for many, many years now.
Hmm. Wow. And then the impact on your relationship or your family or friends, are you comfortable to say
Sure.
anything about that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And one of the things, and I'm sure we'll get into some of this, but one of the things that's really common, a lot of people who are neurodivergent, are really drawn to other neurodivergent people. So the relationship patterns look different. Some of the really great, patterns are fascinating and really common, and some of the not so great patterns. So doing a lot of work with other people really shed some light on struggles I had growing up. And you really, it's both validating and upsetting, when you see when people are coming to me just in huge numbers who have had, a lot of trauma as it pertains to relationships and communication, friendships, therapy, that there's just a lot of things that have been really difficult because this neurotype isn't really understood. So when you have people coming in saying, "Hey, my therapist said XYZ, and that really doesn't fit," and it was really upsetting and traumatic, it really makes you make sure that you want to be doing a good job, you want to be understanding what you're doing. So I have seen a lot of a lot of people who would share that their relationships kind of took on these familiar patterns. And it was eye-opening. There was a lot there that
Mm.
really resonated for me. So I had been drawn very much to like I'm divorced, but my first husband had a lot of traits of ADHD, which was ultimately the kind of responsible for the demise of the marriage that we like couldn't make it work. But I can see now looking back, like the healthy parts of that, the parts that I really liked, the parts that were really intriguing to me and the sameness. But ultimately, the differences were just too much. So in recent years, and I'm remarried now, I think I would have a lot of trouble being with a partner that is not neurodivergent in some way, because it really to connect with someone, you sort of, I don't know, for me at least, there needs to be some sameness and intensity, and in growth and learning and activities and things like that. And that is a beautiful, magical part of neurodiverse relationships in most instances.
Mm. Wow. Can you say a little more about the patterns that you see? Maybe an example or,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
So to me, I think with neurotypical relationships, people often describe like a spark. I met somebody and we clicked, things like that. I think with neurodiverse people, neurodivergent people, it is really, it's like a bonfire and a house is on fire. I mean, the spark is huge, and people typically, they click almost immediately. This is very common that people talk about, I met my partner and I just was immediately comfortable with them. And then, we were inseparable from then on. I hear that more often than not. And it doesn't necessarily always fit sort of what you would expect the norms to be. A lot of people move very quickly in terms of cohabitation. They move very quickly. If they're interested in marriage, they move very quickly to that. So there can be this just shared comfort really, really quickly that's either there or not there for most people. So a lot of people will come in and say, I dated neurotypical people for years and just felt like an alien. I felt like I didn't understand why people dated. I wasn't interested in sex. I wasn't interested in any of the things that my friends wanted. And then I met my partner. And I can't even tell you how many times people tell me, like, my partner that, the healthy relationships when they're coming into therapy, they'll say, I met them when I was 17, or I met them, they were the first person I dated when I was 23. And we've been together ever since. And I think partnership, in a lot of ways, for people who want to be partnered, is often this incredibly stabilizing factor for neurodivergent people where they really do spend a lot of time together. They really do regulate together. They deal with a lot of their autistic traits in a way that is very healthy by having another person with them. So it may look in generalist practitioner eyes as, maybe even a little bit codependent, but I think with neurodivergent people, it's a little different. And I don't think it's got the same kind of negative glow to it that you think of when you think of codependence. So it's different. There's a lot of differences.
Interesting. And of course, on this Self-Led in Bed podcast, we're
Hmm.
looking at sexuality, which of course is complex and is a multi-determined thing. And so I'm curious then how awareness of neurotype might impact sexuality,
Oh,
which is
yes.
a huge topic. But and here we are with
Yes.
couples. So maybe if we start with maybe in either a
Ah,
mixed couple, I'm hearing,
yeah.
the complementarity that can happen when both people um, are neurodiverse. And then there's mixed, like you said,
Yeah, mixed neurotype.
mixed
Yeah.
neurotypes also. So yeah. What do you see?
Yeah.
What do you
Oh, so much
yeah.
there. And this was the part of it that even my certification program, we minimally touched on this, and it has become a really fascinating part of my practice. The sexuality stuff is complex, but there are some themes for sure. And I think the bigger picture with autism is that a lot of things exist in the extremes. So, you'll see people who are very, very, very clean and orderly, and everything has a system, and their house has a place for everything. And then you'll see people who have a really hard time, keeping up with clutter and organization and laundry and things like that, and not a lot of middle ground, really. And I found that the sexuality piece is often that way. There are certainly themes of relationships and things like that. I think normativity kind of goes out the window. All the compulsory sexuality stuff kind of goes out the window in that the norms are different. And I think a lot of neurodivergent people are okay with that. They don't feel the same pressure to kind of conform to what everybody is doing. They often ask a lot of questions about why people would do that. So I notice a lot of people, even in getting into relationships, they'll say, I don't really know what I like. I don't really know what I want. I don't even know what gender I'm attracted to in a lot of ways. So it really depends more on the person to me than the physical body or the body parts or, anything like that, which is kind of a really cool place to start. Because, you see people listening to their instincts and following that, which I think a lot of us don't listen to those instincts. So that's different. Sexuality is broad, gender is broad. So there's a lot more just kind of being open to uniqueness and not necessarily conforming. But there are definitely some themes that I see that bring people to therapy too. All of the um, kind of diversity stuff is sort of I would just say like feature, not a bug. It's just something to pay attention to. Relationship structures are different. There's a lot more ethical non-monogamy, quite a lot of monogamy as well. I don't think there's any one way. that it shows up. But I will say, in terms of the sexuality piece, we do see some themes that I think are a little bit unique as compared to neurotypical relationships. And I think the one that I see most commonly is that, when people do meet and they have that really, quick spark and they feel really connected, they can have a phenomenal sex life in the very beginning of the relationship. And oftentimes people will say, this was the best sex I'd ever had. This was a person who was so tuned into me and really listened to what I said and put it into practice and things like that. And then they find when there is a change, there's some kind of transition, whether they move in together or, they get married or they have a baby or, something changed, they get a new job. A lot of times the sex just drops off. And they find they have a really hard time getting back to what they did before. And I would say this is different than what you hear about like honeymoon phase. It's not like that where like frequency decreases. It's that it really sort of drops off. And I think there's a lot of interesting factors that go into that. But most people who come in saying that think that something horrible has happened, and they don't necessarily look through the lens of autism and all the things that could go along with that. So that's one that I noticed almost
Yeah.
immediately.
So right there, could you say a little more about how the lens of autism would be impacting that beyond what, say, a neurotypical couple might experience?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of trouble. Autistic brains really need predictability, and predictability is so comfortable, and it's like a soft blanket that you carry around all the time. So most people will find that they naturally have given themselves a lot of predictability in their lives, whether that's their job schedule, the what they eat every single day, or the way that they spend their free time, things like that. It feels really regulating, really comfortable. So when a lot of people get into relationships, especially in the beginning, they typically establish a schedule, whether it's, we get together Wednesdays and Fridays, we have sex after we go out to dinner, we do this, we do that. It often follows a very predictable pattern. And when that pattern changes, it can be really disruptive to just the way that autistic brains kind of view relationships. So if you have a situation where you're sleeping over at someone's house a couple times a week, and every time you go there, you have sex, you have dinner, you go to sleep, you go to work, it becomes something that your body knows how to predict and knows how to show up. And then a lot of times when they move in together or when they have a child or they, get married and the rules all change, a lot of people will say, I don't really know how to apply the way that we interacted before to now. Like the person's here all the time. How do I know when they want sex? Or, before we had slotted time for that. And now, we have a lot of other things to do. So it's not that they necessarily have lost desire for sex. It's almost just like very confusing to kind of implement a new structure to what that looks like.
Mhm.
And then there's a lot of things that go along with that. Being perceived is really tough for autistic people, just being in a house with somebody else. Even if you really, really think that person's awesome, it takes a toll on the nervous system almost immediately. So a lot of people will find very quickly that they're not getting the solitude they need and they feel terrible about needing the solitude because they really like their partner.
Mhm.
So there's just a lot of different like autistic things that can happen from cohabitation. And so many partners come in and say to me, like, I don't know what happened. Like, I love my partner. I genuinely like being married to them, but I can't be with someone all of the time. And it feels like my mental health is tanking because there's someone
Mhm.
always in my physical space at home.
Mhm.
So
So
that,
really needing that place to shelter, like a place for some restoration,
yeah,
I'm not using the right words here,
like
like
reset.
self-regulation, just like
Sure.
some alone time. And so then how would you help a couple like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I put in place is solitude. Where do you get your solo time, and can we look at that as neutral? And maybe that fits in with some of the IFS stuff too. There is a part of you that really, really needs to be alone in order to be healthy, and that has nothing to do with your partner doing anything wrong. It doesn't mean that your life is terrible. It doesn't mean that you're not connected, but the you need is very different than the couple need. So that's almost always my first go-to is where do you stand with alone time and where do you stand with special interests? Because a lot of people, when they live alone, they have a ton of time for special interests. So, if you're somebody that comes home and plays video games after work for 3 hours, eats the same dinner every night, and now all of a sudden someone's like, why didn't you ask me about my day? And,
Mhm.
why do you have to be playing video games so much? And, I don't want to eat that. It's not just, it's not an issue of compromising. Most people they understand why other people need to have different things, but their body is like, but I need that time to not talk, and I need that time to have the same dinner, and I need my day to have some element of regulation in it. So it actually,
Yeah.
special interests and alone time are regulating. It's not just
Mhm.
a hobby. It's not just for fun. It actually like helps the
Mm.
nervous system get back to baseline. So we
Mm.
try to find that somewhere. And I help partners to go, hey, this isn't, this isn't anything that's deficient about your relationship. This is just a personal need.
Mhm.
And where can we find pockets of, either alone time or a system? You come home, the first 30 minutes, we don't talk to each other. We don't look at each other. We
Mhm.
don't even go to the
Yeah,
bathroom.
yeah.
You might
Hmm.
get a different result if you can regulate
Mhm.
first.
What I see, which um, I think is right along these lines, is then sometimes people's parts can take offense at that. Say you're the person who wants conversation at dinner, and the partner, your partner is the one who has these routines. When you can, I think this can be the helpfulness of a diagnosis or a category or some framework to understand the behavior, because what we can often do is our most vulnerable parts start to feel unwanted.
Yes.
And in, IFS, we talk about exiles, or, these very vulnerable parts of ourselves that maybe have been wounded in other relationships, or maybe haven't been wounded, but just expect to be met and
Yes.
loved up. And when
Yes.
that isn't happening, then a lot of meaning making can happen. You
That's
don't
exactly
love
it.
me, you don't
Yes.
care, I'm not good enough. And so
100%.
in my practice, I know that's really important, is like slowing down and looking at A, what's happening, B, what are you subjectively experiencing around this, and
Yes.
then what meaning making is happening and what parts are starting to, take on roles.
Yes, that's exactly it. And it's a very similar way to how I would explain it. I usually say, there's like the data, there's what you can observe, like you're not talking at dinner. We can both agree, you didn't say anything when I talked about my day. And, the meaning, so to one person, it's like, well, I was listening and you didn't ask a question. So where did I go wrong there? And the other person is like, you don't care about me. You don't
Mhm.
want to know how my day was. You didn't
Mhm.
ask any questions to show that you were interested. And a lot of times, that's meaning that, maybe one partner has developed that the other hasn't. And it gets even more complicated. There's issues surrounding, tone of voice and kind of the, affect stuff, where some people don't realize the way that they sound when they're overwhelmed. They don't hear their own volume increasing. They don't know, that what they think is talking sounds like yelling and things like that. So it gets a lot easier for partners to write a story that is pretty negative. And that's where therapy, can make or break situations like that, because a lot of couples have come to me and said, my therapist said I was abusive, and they said that I said these things that are out of line, and that's emotional abuse. And they're so confused as to what that even means, because they don't experience themselves the
Mhm.
way that their partners do.
Yeah.
Because, they know that, oh, I wasn't yelling, I didn't mean it like that. So there's just so much room for interpretation. And that's why I think the parts work would fit really well with some of this understanding. And that, if you explain to someone, you're really hurting me when you don't show me that you care. The step one might be, how do I show you that I care? Like, how, what do you
Mhm.
need me to say? How would I ask that? What kinds of questions? So there's a lot of psychoeducation around, all of this neurodivergent stuff, and couples work especially. What does that mean? What does emotional connection
Mhm.
mean? Things like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, yeah. It's something I see working with sexuality, is
Mm.
then, of course, our relationship outside the bedroom door impacts how close we want to be with each other. So if there's been a lot of tension, or a feeling of not being attuned to, or having to do maybe what feels like an unfair amount of the emotional labor in the family, or making sure someone does what they need to do, which can happen a lot with adult ADHD,
Yeah,
things like that. That might not lead to feeling super sexy and a desire to be close.
absolutely.
So, uh, you know, that's one element that can impact physical sexuality. And then another, and maybe you can talk to this, do you find some people at least with autism, maybe particularly sensitive to certain kinds of touch or
My
textures
gosh. Yeah.
or those things, because that comes up a lot around, sex can be, very, have
Sensory.
smells,
So
sensory things
sensory.
that either,
Oh,
the
God.
same
Yeah.
thing that makes something a turn on, is can also be overwhelming and gross, to somebody. And
Yeah.
yeah, do you see that more
Oh,
perhaps with the population that you work with?
absolutely. And, it's often, people often describe sensory sensitivity. They use the word sensitivities. And I find that most people that talk to me about their sensitivity, quote unquote sensitivities, they're actually in pain. I mean, it really is. It's not just oh, this isn't something I would prefer. The way, if you smelled a perfume that you didn't like, that's not really for me. That to me is a sensitivity or, oh, that's strong. This is really nausea, migraines, it's my ears feel like they're bleeding, like my head is pounding. So when you incorporate something like a sensitivity to smell, most people who are neurodivergent don't even realize that people around them are not having that same experience. So something that you smell so clearly, or the lights that you can hear buzzing, the people around you don't even hear. So sex is incredibly sensory. And what a quick way bring some problems into the bedroom, when you say like, I can't handle fluids, I can't handle that, it's cold, I can't handle that it smells different. Like there's a lot of things that are just natural body things that, it's no one's fault, but the reality is it's really, really tough for some people. So it's kind of a fascinating can of worms to open because there's a lot you can do to help with those types of things when you make it just a neutral statement. Hey, I
Mhm.
have a lot of trouble with smells. Okay, great. That's great to know. How can we work on that? But sometimes it gets trickier. I've had partners that come in and say, the feel of my partner's body has changed over time. And I don't say this from a, standpoint of, any kind of like shame towards, their size or anything, but there is something about the way that they feel to me that is like a turn off now and is really hard for me to be around. And oh my gosh, how are we bringing that up in a
Mhm.
way that's,
Right.
comfortable to talk about? So there's sensory things that are tricky. That are certainly not an easy fix in a lot of
Mhm.
situations.
Yeah. For me, I think as part of my neurodiversity, and I identify as having ADHD and some different kinds of processing challenges, which has been a journey as well to recognize those things over the course of my life. And for me, when things go fast, I get to a point where I stop taking it in.
Yeah,
Um, I can't process it. So and I think that can happen with touch too. Like touch, so there's the disgust reaction or like something that can be, I really appreciate that idea that it's pain. It's not just unpleasant, it's painful or it's intolerable,
absolutely.
right? And then also like pace, right? Like and the
Yes,
type of touch. So being able to communicate, know your own body, be able to know or have the freedom to experiment,
absolutely.
like maybe just, sometimes someone will say, I like strong, heavy touch, but nothing
Yes.
tickly,
Absolutely. That's the number one thing that comes up almost immediately. One of the ways that we introduce, kind of different ways to use scripting and language is to, use number scales and do it that way where you say, okay, one being gentle, tickly kind of touch and five being deep pressure, what can you handle today? Or, what do you like? And for some people, it's like always going to be five. And some people, depending upon the rest of their day, they can kind of tolerate more or less. But I also help people to use like really, again, just like neutralize it. Like this is not something that's good or bad. It just is. It's no different
Mhm.
than what you like or don't like. So for some people, parts of their body can be off limits certain days where like, hey, I just can't handle touch in XYZ places today. So I know one couple we started with like a red light, green light game that we would do before, okay, so here's how you say, how would you like to hear that? What would feel safe to you and, not make you feel defensive. So that's what they started to do. They would, identify the parts of the body that were red, yellow, and green. And that was how they started. And it took all the shame out of it. Don't touch
Mhm.
me there, can make it somebody feel off. So things like that, where, let's put something in place that we can rely on so that we don't have to, figure out a way for this to be almost confrontational, which is how it can feel for a lot of
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
So if you expect it, hey, what can you handle today? Or what do you want to try? And a lot of clients use, sensory like techniques. Sometimes they have weighted blankets that they use in the bedroom, or they can't have cold air on them, or they have to be in the shower, and that eliminates some of the fluid situation, or they can't be cold or too hot, or they have to have water. So if you plan for that, it no longer feels weird to chime in and say you need something.
Mhm.
So just kind of like proactively, like what can we do before we
Mhm.
get started to set ourselves up for success?
Mhm. Yeah. And I hear in that also, and this is kind of a IFS thing too, we have this notion of self-energy that, when our parts relax, then we gain access to
Mhm.
our authentic self, and we access qualities of creativity and, being able to solve problems and just be present as we are. And I know a big conversation in the IFS community is about the nature of autism in the internal system. And from what I've heard, it's and what resonates for me as well is the idea that this self is autistic, that autism isn't a part,
Yes.
that this is at least embodied self energy, we're experiencing ourselves through the body and the wiring that we have. And so it's not a part, but we may have parts that have had to cope with, the reactions of the world or trying to mediate,
Yeah.
and parts can get wounded through all the kinds of things that you've been speaking to.
Yes, it's so great to hear you say that. I remember so clearly a client came to me after working with someone who was an IFS therapist, and she said, "My therapist told me my autism was a part," and she's like, that just really doesn't fit for me."
Hmm.
And she's like, "My autism is me. Like, it's not just a part of me; it's in all of my parts." And she was really put off by that. And we did a lot of talking about that. So, in that case, she was really able to explain to me, what that meant to her. But it's such an interesting, piece to consider too, because sensitivity, what might be sensitivity in the bedroom in certain ways to touch or something like that, may be something that's frustrating on some level, but it also can be something that's like deeply pleasurable at the same time if you accommodate it, right? So if you know what
Right.
somebody wants, it's not always just a drag, it's just something to understand and appreciate. So I
Hmm.
wonder if that goes along with what you're saying too, is that like if we can accommodate these needs, you're unlocking something that maybe someone has never given you before, which is that
Hmm.
comfort and those accommodations for what you need.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Hmm.
That would,
Yeah.
would be a nice outcome.
Hmm. Yeah.
That would be a
Yeah.
win-win. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so the practices that you are there practices that you encourage for people, and I'm genuinely curious if these
Mhm.
would like be helpful or the opposite of helpful.
Yeah.
Things like mindfulness,
Yeah.
body awareness,
Yeah.
those kinds of things. And I'm sure, of course, we'd have to ask the individuals that we're
Yeah.
working with how that lands for them. But do you find that some of those kinds of practices are helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And I try to keep it in most of my work, it's really from the autism lens. So we will start with, I have a visual that I use that's it's like a DJ board, and a lot of the areas that are impacted by autism are on there. So everybody's dials for certain things are turned up and turned down. So some people might have much higher sensory sensitivity, or emotional dysregulation could be really high, really low. So we try to bring that to all of the areas. So for intimacy purposes, we put that in the mix right from the start. What is it that you need to handle these things that are a part of your presentation to make this okay for you? So does that look like a different kind of connection before intimacy? Does your need for predictability really rule a lot of your ability to relax? So in situations like that, date night can be a nightmare. I mean, for a lot of people, I've heard this so many times where people will say, my partner wants a date night, and I know that's supposed to be a thing that couples do that feels good, and I hate it because all I'm thinking is, what if I'm full? What if I'm, I can't perform? What if I'm tired? What if I drink too much? And so the anxiety ruins the whole night for them. So in cases like that, it's like, okay, so you need predictability and you don't want to do it at the end of the night when you're low energy. We need to be talking about morning sex. We need to be talking about scheduling things out. And I remember Tammy Nelson saying in another training I did with her, when people have affairs, like the planning is the hottest thing, right? Like that's why people are having so much fun when they have affairs because they're planning all these things and someone is spending a lot of energy being like, oh, I'm going to make this time for you. It's not always a drag to plan. So reminding people that planning doesn't mean boring. It doesn't mean, that's the only time we connect, but it can be really helpful to say, we're going to make this a priority. So I take that even further. Sometimes we'll do menus and have different programs. Sometimes we'll do, some partners really like to know, like, how long are we doing this for? And that may sound less than romantic, but it's helpful, like anything else. Knowledge kind of gives their body time to predict what it's going to be like for them. So they may need to know, is a short program, long program? Are we doing all the things, some of the things? And often when you give a little heads up like that, a lot of people are really into it. It's the ambiguity and the not knowing that can be a real turn
Mhm.
off.
Yeah. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm thinking about couples I've worked with that are opposites that way, where, for one of the turn on is spaciousness and
Mm,
not knowing where this is going to go and being spontaneous and not feeling like the clock is ticking,
yeah.
and then for the other person, it's like, I can't relax, like you said, unless I have some idea of how long I'm in this for. And, there's some point at which I have a need to do something else. But then if that, so helping couples negotiate those differences
Yeah.
can be challenging sometimes.
It is tricky. And I try to help people to find ways to make it sound less like something you're talking about in therapy and more like something that's a fun game we play together. I think there's something about, creating sexy menus with funny names and, like adding a little humor to it that sometimes can make it seem more exciting or fun. I know a lot of people really like to incorporate fantasy. They like to incorporate, there's a lot of crossover with BDSM stuff, with kink stuff, where people really like the idea of having rules and it's not vanilla. It's not boring. It
Hmm.
really is. It is just structure. So I think that there is oftentimes a lot of shared crossover. Even if you want very different things, there generally is some crossover in the middle of that Venn diagram
Hmm.
if you can, be open to creativity.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. The fun, I'm curious what a fun menu might look like.
Yeah. Well, there was one couple and we created this whole thing where, there it was sort of and I can't even, it was so long ago, I can't even remember the language I used, but the idea of kind of like a light program, which was more like snuggly and cuddly and kind of just like touchy, but not like full intimacy, and kind of like, light, medium, and then the full program. And there was something about that was just a huge game changer from what they had tried to do before, where one partner just felt like, well, every time she just wants it, then I just have to perform. And then the anxiety just took over and the whole experience was unpleasant. So for a lot of people, and I've heard, imago therapists talk about different ways that they do things like this, and other sex therapists talk about similar strategies that they use where, we're saying we're not going to talk about sex for a while, or we're not going to, put kind of pressure on it. But I think it's a little bit more of like just the structure of like, what do you need from me? And I always compare it to, like being at work. Like if you work in a corporation and you have a meeting, like we don't just show up whenever and talk about whatever with whomever. We show up and we say, we're talking for an hour. These are the points we need to discuss. You're responsible for this and you need to bring that. And at hard stop at 11 o'clock, we got to be out of here. There's another meeting in this room. Be here. And if we're not finished, then we meet another time. There's nothing wrong with that. Some direction is great. And a lot of people really like that framework. So that's not a less than approach. It's just targeted, it's
Hmm.
planned. So when you put it that way, it's like, oh yeah, we're here to achieve a goal. What's the goal? Let's talk about it.
Hmm. Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So, is there anything else that you might want to share with listeners, maybe who are wondering, am I autistic? Is my partner autistic? Are we a neurodivergent couple?
Absolutely. There's a lot out there on social media. There's a lot out there kind of in the world of the internet currently where 5, 10 years ago there just wasn't. And I find that most people who are curious about neurodivergence, there's usually a reason. It's very, very rare that I have people come to me that think that they are neurodivergent and are not. So if it's something that is interesting or feels like it's making sense, it's generally worth talking to someone about. There's a lot of online screening tests and things like that, but I think the diagnosis is really important for some people and not as important for others, and that's a real reality that is sort of a necessary part of working in autistic spaces. And that I think that's okay. So, if you do think that you're in a neurodiverse partnership, it might be really helpful to speak with a couples, if you're going to couples therapy anyway, to speak to someone who has that background and just say, hey, it may or may not be interesting to us to go through, a whole assessment. But we would like to work with someone who has strategies for the kind of brains that we may or may not have. And I think it's a different approach. I think it's probably pretty different than what you get with a generalist practitioner. But there's also, there are books, there are resources, there are YouTube channels, and I try to stay as current as I can in my social media and on my website to give people, podcasts and things to listen to outside of therapy as well. Because honestly, some of my biggest aha moments have come from podcasts and, Instagram posts and things like
Hmm.
that. So I certainly don't think all of the awareness comes from therapy, but it definitely can help to get some targeted professional help too.
Okay, yeah. And I imagine also like to maybe help with difficult communications or, trying to see the forest for the trees, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Absolutely. The communication is a big piece. And, if there were anything that, people could take away from some of the just the neurodivergent concepts, scripting and asking for the kind of communication that you want can be a big switch for people. So, even I call it, conversational consent, but a lot of neurodivergent people are like, I love to monologue, I'll talk all day about what happened, at work or, what I'm thinking about or a book I want to write. But not everybody has the capacity to hold that all of the time. And so, if you're in a differently neurodiverse partnership where, your partner doesn't have the same shared interests as you, or they're neurotypical, it's a habit that you need to get into to ask if somebody, has the capacity for what you may or may not need at that moment. So that can really affect intimacy and connection, and those types of things. So, even saying like you seem grumpy, there's a lot of neurodivergent people that if you say, oh, you're in a bad mood or you seem grumpy, that can really be dysregulating. So learning, how does your partner want to be addressed when you notice something is going on? Or how does your partner want to hear, I can't really do touch right now, in a way that doesn't make them feel terrible about trying, things like that. So in therapy, we work a lot on, scripting and language that feels safer so that we're not inviting those parts to come in
Hmm.
and feel rejected and shut down and not good enough, because a lot of the me things will affect partners and it doesn't necessarily mean it's a them thing.
Hmm. Did you have anything you were curious about in terms of our two professional areas and,
Yeah.
anything that might be a growth edge for you?
I do. I really, I find myself talking to clients a lot about externalizing things that they don't love that come with their, blend of autistic traits. So whether it's, I have a nervous system that gets involved when, I'm overwhelmed and I don't like the way I talk to my partner during that time, or there's something I would like to do sexually and I can't make myself do it. And I feel like that externalization is so in line with what I do know about IFS. And I
Hmm.
would just love to know what kind of crossover might be helpful.
Hmm.
And I would love to know
Hmm.
more about how IFS would look at that.
Hmm. So when you say externalization, say, there's something I want to do for my partner, but I just can't. Are you
Yeah.
saying how to make it less personal for themselves.
Yeah, like the way that I guess the way that I would phrase it a lot of times is, um, when XYZ happens, I notice, something coming up in myself. Like I notice that this feeling's happening because it's sometimes hard to even identify what that feeling is or what's going on in the body or what the emotion is. But they feel something, they feel something that is kind of taking them out of the game. And I'm wondering, might that be a better way? Maybe IFS could
Yeah.
provide some better language or, a part there that could make that easier.
Yeah. So we would I would guide someone to be curious about that and just say, like, do you want to do a little role play here for a minute? Do you want to
Yeah,
be that person?
sure. Okay.
Yeah, maybe just say that first thing that's a concern.
Okay. This is one of the common ones. Like, you're all over me right now, and I just like I can't do touch right now. Like, I don't want any of this. I'm tired. I've had a long day.
Okay. Okay. And so when you feel that way, are you curious about having a different way to express that to your partner?
This doesn't make them feel bad that they can understand this is something that, I am needing this right now.
Okay. So would it be okay to ask you a little bit about your experience of that?
Sure.
Like when your partner's coming at you or, touching you a lot, what do you notice? What's the first thing you would sense maybe in or around your body or, what instinct do you feel?
Yeah, the instinct would be to kind of like push them away, maybe say something not so gentle, kind of run out of the situation, get away.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
it's visceral, just a need
Uh-huh.
to eject myself from the situation.
Hmm. Okay, great. And I noticed you pushing with your hands,
Mm.
and I wondered if you could almost be that for a minute. Can you
Yeah.
put yourself in a moment and just like, yeah,
Yes.
be there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
and just noticing maybe on maybe a 10-point scale or something, like how uncomfortable are you in this moment?
Like 8 or 9.
Hmm. Okay, 8 or 9. And is there something that you know already um, that you could offer to your partner so that it didn't push you to that zone? Like, is it something about how, that you're noticing their tone of voice? Is it the touch thing? Is it, I guess I'm just wondering if you notice a specific thing.
Mhm. I would say touch and proximity, like very like having someone close when I'm
Hmm.
needing space,
Hmm.
and then yeah, that physical, any kind of playful, any kind of
Hmm.
touch.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. So, I just want to really honor that that's your experience, and I just wonder if you're feeling open to yourself there.
Hmm.
Like, is it okay to just pause a minute and really acknowledge how intense that is?
I get the sense that it's okay, but I also mm, feel like a force of not
Hmm.
okayness coming from those around me. So
Yeah.
there is a sense of disappointment,
Hmm.
or almost rejection coming through, but I don't understand why that person thinks that it's about them.
Right, right. So it sounds like there may be a part here that is wanting to, you know, prevent harm, maybe to others or hurt feelings to others, but it's hard to know how to do that because
Yes.
the instinct is so strong and the need is so strong.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost like the part almost feels to me like a like how an animal would react. Like
Hmm.
no softening, no words, no nothing, just a
Hmm.
reaction. Just get out
Hmm.
of there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So in this moment, if we were to look at how much room you feel, like, do you feel any room around that reaction? Like, oh, I could have 5%, I could have 5 seconds, I could have 10 seconds before I leave or push back.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's available,
Hmm.
but just wondering, is it a 100% impulse or does it feel like there's, a little bit of bandwidth to be able to maybe say something?
I would say 95%, but it would have to be nonverbal.
Mm-hmm.
It would have
Okay.
some kind of a, if there was communication, it wouldn't be verbal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And how does that feel to you, the idea of having maybe a signal or a word, well, not verbal, so like some kind of cue or
Yeah,
signal.
signal would be awesome. If the
Mm-hmm.
signal could happen and the person could read the signal and there wouldn't be lingering resentment,
Mm-hmm.
that would be
Mm-hmm.
perfection.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I'm really appreciating that in your system, there's some willingness,
Hmm.
to try to find a solution, that works for your, self-care, like just that instinct, that need,
Yeah,
but it's trying to open up some way of communicating that would work,
yeah,
for your partner.
absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think a signal would be so much better. The words make it,
Hmm.
takes it to a different place.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe we can pause the
Yeah.
role play there, but um, just curious how that felt for you.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. That idea of making it very concrete, I think is very helpful. And also understanding that it's not just like the separation. It doesn't make you a bad partner because you need something. It
Hmm.
makes you a person that needs something. And I think that makes that very clear.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And if it was the person and their partner,
Mm,
there would be then the exploration of, well, what happens for you, partner, when,
yes.
you get that pushing away,
Yeah.
and what
Yeah.
happens in your system and how does that feel and how do you understand that and,
Yeah.
what might work for you,
Mhm.
and then sort of collaboratively maybe seeing if there's a nonverbal cue that could work.
Yeah, that also, I think that makes so much sense. And if the part that's coming up for the partner is feeling rejected or, just kind of shot down, understanding for the person that needs the space, like how can I take space for me and not cause rejection?
Hmm.
Whether that's coming back later and addressing that part, or whether
Hmm.
that's the way I say, what I need. I think that's so helpful to see it
Hmm.
as our parts are having trouble with one another right now.
Right, right. And what I've seen is that sometimes, that there's kind of a disconnect in terms of like I'm just saying how I feel, or you ask me a question, I'm answering it, and
Right.
not really having any framework for understanding why the partner is reacting as they are. And I think in terms of
Yes.
those prediction models, like, oh, if I know more about your internal system and your parts, now I have a better map or a prediction of what you're feeling and why, of what's happening and why. And
Yes.
then that's clearer for me to then do something different because it's more
Yeah, the course
concrete.
correct. Absolutely, because it provides that context. There's this idea of a lot of partners will come in and say their autistic partner is self-centered. And it really isn't self-centered, it's self-focused, where we understand things through ourselves first, and then we apply that to others, what we know about ourselves to understand and to connect with empathy. So if I don't like being touched, I can't imagine in that moment why someone else would want to be touched unless I understand how that it goes for them. So once it's
Mhm.
predictable, once it makes sense, like, oh, okay, so you feel right now the way that I feel, when we're in the bedroom at night and we're totally relaxed, like that's when you want it, but you feel that way on the couch, So it's always using that sense of self to make things make sense. And I love that and how that could intersect with parts work because that really provides framework and understanding.
Mhm. Yeah, 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 cool. Did you have any other questions?
Oh gosh. I'm curious about the exile parts. Like, can you explain that just as a concept?
Sure. So let's say somebody was told as a kid that they were too emotional. And then they, felt things very viscerally. They were told they were too emotional all the time, too sensitive, too emotional. And they learned that I can't show that. I can't, if I do that, I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be, I'm not going to be part of the family or something bad's going to happen. And so it's an unconscious process
Okay.
where it's kind of a natural instinct that we don't want to feel uncomfortable feelings, and
Mm,
we don't want to be disrupted by emotions that are really painful to feel.
okay.
And so, there's this idea that a part of us absorbs the negative messages, the shame, the feeling of being misunderstood or alone, or it could be any sort of painful negative message or emotion. And then that part gets kind of pushed in the basement, like Dick will talk about kind of the basement child. Like it sort of gets pushed out of awareness
Mhm.
because what it's feeling is like it's either inconvenient or intolerable.
Dang.
And so then we have in front, we have these manager parts who are kind of running the show and trying to control life, control relationships so that something doesn't come along that's going to activate that exile and have it kind of burst out of the basement.
Okay. Interesting.
But then if it does burst out of the basement, maybe I'm at work and you know someone's got a TV on loud and someone's telling me I can't have my earbuds in, and then I just like lose my temper or I start to cry because I'm just like so overwhelmed,
Mhm.
and then I feel uh-oh, like I just did something bad. This was
Right.
like not okay here. Then we have these reactive parts which Dick Schwartz called firefighters that come in really fast to take away the pain. So
Okay.
that could be dissociating. Maybe I
Yes.
dissociate. Maybe I just get rageful and just, call people a bunch of names and stomp
Yep.
out.
Yep.
Um, I could do numbing kinds of
Yeah.
behaviors. I leave there and I eat a gallon of ice cream or, so that's kind of the attempt to, once that exile's energy has flooded the system, to try to extinguish it as fast as possible without concern for the consequences later.
Interesting. See,
Yeah.
all fits together so
Yeah.
well. There's so many
Yeah. And then
pieces.
later, when the crisis is over, then all of a
Yeah.
sudden, then there's a mess to clean up.
Yes.
Then it's like, uh-oh, I have to go back to work tomorrow and I made a scene or my partner's mad at me or,
Yeah. And your
I,
ice cream, which is not ideal.
yeah. So we call those self-soothing parts
Okay.
sometimes. But so those, so there's ongoing dynamics, and then we have this idea that we do have self-energy. There's this core quality in us that is calm and has, the capacity to kind of be with all of our parts
Okay.
and to be kind of that maybe solid tree in the middle or something that can balance the system
Hmm.
and can help the parts that are exiled or burdened to come back into inclusion.
That is fascinating. So when you're doing this parts work with people, are they naming these parts? Are they giving, like how does that process go? How
Yeah,
deep do you go with the parts?
right. Well, if someone is unaware of the model and they're new to this, I would listen to what's happening, listen to the story, and then at a certain point, you start to kind of hear, and the person might themselves notice like the place where they really get stuck or where they really feel out of control or they really feel misunderstood.
Okay.
And then we have a way of asking them if they would like to explore that and get to know a little more about what's happening in them. Rather, we call that a U-turn instead of like people start out being very focused on the other
Yeah.
often or
Yeah.
outside people. Like,
Yes.
could we pause here and see what's happening inside of you? And then it's a very respectful inquiry. So I'm not interpreting for the client. I'm sort of
Okay.
being with them and inviting them to be curious. And
Okay.
there's kind of a protocol of helping them explore that. And
Interesting.
in that process, it may emerge as a part,
Yeah.
so we get to know, well, can you see it? Do you feel it? How's it showing up for you? How do you feel toward it? Can you
Okay.
ask it what its job is? How is it trying to help?
Yeah.
So we guide the inquiry.
I like that a lot. Now, one question I have is if you were working with someone who has a lot of trouble identifying like what they're feeling inside in that moment, or
Hmm.
have a lot of trouble, say, visualizing part,
Yeah.
if
Hmm.
that piece is really hard, do you think that it can be modified, for like let's say somebody needs to really, take that idea home and sit on that for a couple days to know what they were feeling in that moment,
Hmm.
or
Right.
maybe they don't have
Yeah.
the time visualizing or something like that
Hmm.
can be accommodated.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's people in the IFS community who really specialize in this area. And I've learned from them. I don't want to say I'm the like most expert on this, but I do have, experience working with
Sure.
people. So some of it's modifying how those, like it's a protocol. There's questions like I know I get in the habit and I'm a very feeling oriented person, so I can use that
Yeah.
feeling language a lot, but sometimes I need to really modify the language and just say,
Okay.
well, what are you saying to yourself? What thoughts are here? Or externalizing with objects or, it could be neutral objects like stones or chips or something, or it could be like sand tray type, items,
I like that.
little figurines and things like that.
Yeah, I like
Like,
that.
can you pick something out here, um, that could stand for the push impulse when
Yes.
your partner gets too close,
Yeah, I like
and
that because that's inclusive. It's like if you, some people would have a much better time associating that with an animal or an object or a
hmm
shape or a color or a word or something like
hmm
that. Whereas if you said, "What are you saying to yourself?" they might say, an autistic person might say, "I'm not saying anything to like, what do
hmm
you mean?" That kind of thing if they don't
hmm
have that strong internal voice.
right, right.
That's interesting. I like that a
Yeah.
lot.
Or if you were going to have a nonverbal cue, how would you remind yourself, that you wanted to do that, that 5% of yourself that wants to try to communicate something so your partner doesn't feel hurt,
Yeah.
you could pick an object or you could make, that red, yellow, traffic light,
Yeah.
card or, so the externalizing could be with objects. And like I said, there's I'm sure ways other people would suggest as well that they've adapted the model to
Yeah.
be, more easily utilized.
I like that. See, now you're making me want to learn more. All right.
Yeah, cool. So thank you again.
So
And
much.
yeah, I love the exchange, as we're learning from each other. And, one of the nice things with IFS is that it can be integrated even without, there's ways to learn it where it's really your primary modality and it can be really an art that takes many years to cultivate. And there's also concepts and practices that are pretty straightforward and can be easily learned and integrated, for
Hmm.
people that practice from other um, perspectives.
Yeah. Oh, I love that idea. That's great because
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
there's never enough tools in the toolbox for
Right. So how could people find you and what do you
me.
have available for people who want to learn more?
So my website is koryandreas.com. And I do have some links on there to my Instagram, which I try to stay as up to date as possible with. But I have quite a few things going on right now. Some teaching. I'm going to be presenting at the Psychotherapy Networker Symposium in a couple weeks. But also there's quite a few things that I offer virtually. And also, I do a retreat a couple times a year. This is a new thing that I'm doing for newly diagnosed, late diagnosed autistic people, where we get together and have a couple days of unmasking and talk about a lot of different autistic topics. So those are all things that are growing and changing. And right now, I'm really rethinking a lot of what I'm doing and how to expand beyond, private practice. It is so important to me that, beyond the people that I see directly in my practice that, we're doing good things for, the big picture of autism awareness and things like that too.
Sounds like lots of wonderful stuff, and I'm excited to read your article and to be able to hopefully go to your symposium presentation. So we'll
Oh, that would
see
be awesome.
if that works out. And
That.
I just want to thank you so much for being here on the podcast. One last thing. I like to
Yes.
ask the guests is if you wanted to share something you find pleasurable when you're not working. And
Hmm.
it doesn't have to be sexual, but it
I just
could
said that.
be.
I'm like, what do I answer here?
Could
You know
be,
what?
but most people have not opted to do that.
You know what? This is my new thing. I have decided very recently that my new very favorite thing is massages and alone time. So I have decided, as much as I can drag myself and it doesn't become a ridiculous expense, that I think touch is one of those things that we often like rely on our partners for, and touch is lovely. And I think a lot of us love touch. I had this realization that, you know what, there are lots of other ways. So whether it's like the feel of stretching or getting a massage or, rolling on one of those roller things, that is one of my like sensory things that I just absolutely love. And it is so restorative. So I never understood the like manicures, like spa day, like that doesn't really do anything for me, but a massage is like the greatest thing ever. So that is my thing right now.
That sounds wonderful.
Love it.
Yeah. And I have a subgroup there. Um, I love massage and
Love.
that kind of touch. So
Yes.
cool. Well, I thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Until next time.